I sat in my car outside the school gate for more than 10 minutes, staring at the stack of ungraded essays on the passenger seat, feeling the familiar ache of yet another Tuesday night when, at 27 years old, my fingers were still stained with red ink. The cooling engine clicked steadily in the silence, each sound falling in rhythm with the exhausted thud of my heartbeat. Jessica's voice still echoed in my mind from the call 20 minutes earlier. "You have to call the police again, Brooke." He showed up, again. She was right. Caleb had been in the parking lot yesterday afternoon, leaning against his silver-gray Dodge, with that terrifyingly confident expression he always wore when he believed he was irresistible. The restraining order meant nothing to him. 6 months after I walked out of that relationship, he still could not accept that I no longer wanted him within a single step of my life. The first time I called the police, they sounded sympathetic. By the 5th time, I could hear the exhaustion in their voices. They would drive by, he would vanish, and the cycle would repeat like a nightmare stuck on loop. I gathered my bag and the stack of essays, locked the car, and stepped into the dense November night. The cold wind sliced through my thin jacket, making me shiver as I crossed the empty lot. Most teachers had gone home hours ago, but I had stayed behind to finish student reports. In truth, it was only an excuse to avoid going back to the hollow apartment, where every echoing corner reminded me of Caleb's silhouette standing outside my window last week. My hand trembled as I searched for my keys. "Steady, Brooke." I slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors immediately, not a habit I had learned in the past few months. The car smelled of stale coffee, and the fading vanilla scent of the charm dangling from the rearview mirror. I turned the key, and the engine roared back to life. My phone rang again. "Jessica." "I'm heading home now," I said, pinning the phone between my cheek and shoulder. "Did you call the police?" "Not yet. Tomorrow." She exhaled sharply, the sound thick with worry. "Brooke, this won't go away on its own. Caleb won't stop." "I know." The words scraped my throat. "I just want to go home and finish grading. I don't want to think about him anymore. But you have to think about your safety. If you want, Mike and I can stay with you for a few days, just until things calm down." I was touched, but I couldn't accept. They had already helped me too much, giving me a place to stay when I first left, helping me move, blocking his number on my phone. I couldn't drag them further into this mess. "I'm fine, I promise. I'll call you when I get home." "You'd better." After we said goodbye, I set the phone on the passenger seat. The road ahead stretched out, slick with the golden reflection of streetlights after an early rain. Traffic had thinned to only a few scattered cars drifting through the night. I merged onto the familiar route that wound toward the Fremont Bridge, the old steel structure arching across the Willamette River. I always found the bridge beautiful at night, lights shimmering against the water like a floating ribbon of stars. But tonight, something felt wrong. A strange pressure tightened around my chest, making my breath shallow, as if someone was watching me from far away. "Stop imagining things. Caleb isn't following you." But he had before. 3 weeks earlier, I had noticed his car trailing me for 15 long minutes before it turned away. When I confronted him through text, he said it was just coincidence. My grip tightened on the wheel as I drove up onto the bridge, the river below swirling in black currents. Only 2 cars remained on the span, one far ahead, one far behind. Then it happened. A violent shriek tore from my engine, a sound so sharp it stole the breath from my lungs. The car suddenly lurched forward, accelerating wildly even as my foot slammed the brake. It veered left, and I yanked the wheel right by instinct. But the car didn't respond. Instead, it swayed uncontrollably, the rear fishtailing across the slick pavement. "No, no," I screamed, wrestling the wheel as it spun uselessly beneath my hands. The harder I braked, the faster the car seemed to surge, the wet road turning the world into a spinning blur. The night exploded into chaos. The vehicle slammed into the metal guardrail with a howl of twisting steel, and then I was airborne. And if the moment Brooke's car lifted from the Fremont Bridge, or the instant that powerful hand pulled her back from the edge of death held you breathless the way it held her, please subscribe to our channel, tap like, and share this video so you won't miss the chapters ahead filled with suspense, emotion, and the twists that shape destiny. And tell us where you're watching from. Leave a comment with the name of your city or your country, so I know how far Brooke's fight for survival has traveled across this world. The moment my car left the bridge, everything shattered into fragments of disordered time. Sound vanished. Only the pounding of blood in my ears and the tortured groan of metal tearing free from its hinges remained. I felt the horrifying emptiness of weightlessness as the vehicle pitched forward, flipping in slow, merciless motion, as though time wished to stretch each second before surrendering me to the dark below. The river beneath was thick and black as oil, cold and merciless. My arms flailed, striking anything within reach as I searched blindly for the seatbelt release. I don't remember how I pressed the button. I only know the belt snapped free and I was thrown sideways. Instinct overrode thought. I grabbed the door handle and yanked. The door screeched open while the car was still spinning through the air. Freezing wind slammed into my face, howling past my ears like the scream of something unseen reaching for my life. I shoved myself toward the cod, opening. My shoulder struck the frame hard enough to send lightning pain shooting through my arm, but I didn't stop. I clawed my way across the tilting interior, sliding over cold, rain-slick metal, reaching for anything solid. Then I felt at a rough concrete edge where the guardrail had once stood. My fingers seized it, nails digging into the frigid surface, as if my entire existence balanced on those trembling tips. My body swung beneath me, suspended above a chasm of darkness, my feet finding nothing. Below, my car plummeted. I heard the explosion of water breaking, felt the vibration shudder up through the bridge as the vehicle crashed into the river and vanished into foam and shadow. Ice-cold droplets splashed upward, striking my face. I screamed, a raw, primal sound torn from the deepest place within me, as pain, shock, and terror collided. My hands were slipping. The concrete was slick and razor-sharp, numbing my fingers. I couldn't hold on much longer. Wind whipped across the bridge, and just as my strength faltered, a sudden beam of light swept over me. Headlights. I heard brakes, a car door slamming, then footsteps fast, urgent. "Hold on!" A man's voice rang out, strong, deep, and steady like wind striking stone. I couldn't turn my head, but I felt him moving toward me. Moments later, a pair of hands wrapped around my wrists, warm, firm, unshaking. "I've got you. Don't let go." His arms pulled with staggering force, lifting my body upward across the raw concrete, scraping my skin, igniting pain, but none of it mattered. He hauled me up inch by inch until my shoulder caught the edge, then my elbow, then my entire body collapsed onto the cold surface of the bridge. I lay there gasping, my chest burning, my throat raw. Shock made everything distant, even my own limbs. "Are you hurt anywhere?" His voice came again, closer now, gentler but still anchored with control. I turned my head to look at the man who had just dragged me back into the world. He knelt beside me, tall and solid, his dark coat catching the glow of the streetlights, his eyes shining with an amber-brown intensity that felt both protective and piercing. That gaze made me feel safe and seen, in a way I had not felt for months. I don't know," I whispered, every word scraped from somewhere deep. His hand rested lightly on my arm, steady, grounding. He leaned closer, examining the scrapes and bruises along my skin with a care so deliberate it felt as though he feared breaking something precious. And in that moment, something shifted in the air, as if the bridge itself had witnessed more than an accident. A life had been lifted from the brink, and the hands holding onto it would not let go easily ever again. He helped me sit up slowly, his hand gripping my shoulder as if afraid I might fall backward at any second, my body still trembling, my heart pounding so violently it felt ready to crack through my ribs just to escape. My hands were streaked with scratches, blood seeping from thin cuts sharp as razor blades, the metallic tang mixing with the smell of engine smoke and the cold river mist rising from below. I lifted my gaze to the man who had pulled me back from the mouth of death, his face carved into two contrasting halves by darkness and the pool of streetlight overhead. Yet I could still make out the hard lines of his features, the firm angles of his jaw, and the intense, winter-sharp eyes that were anything but empty. He was unlike anyone I had ever met, something in the way he moved, in the way he looked at me, making me feel both deeply grateful and instinctively on guard. I tried to speak, my voice a dry rasp caught in my throat. "Who are you?" He studied me for a moment, then gave a small nod, as if confirming I was still conscious. "I am Dominic Reyes." He reached into his coat and pulled out a linen handkerchief, folded it neatly, then held it out to me. "You're bleeding. Press this on the cut. Hard." I did as he said, feeling the soft fabric and catching the faint, lingering scent of musk, clean, expensive, understated. Dominic glanced toward the broken stretch of guardrail where my car had vanished. "You're lucky to be alive." I nodded, tears pushing up so fast I couldn't hold them back, not from pain but from the sudden collapse of everything I had been holding inside for months. I had just escaped death, and now I was sitting on the cold pavement beside a man I had never met, and somehow, impossibly, I trusted him more than I had trusted anyone in a long time. I don't know what happened. I was driving and then something exploded, and the car I lost control. Dominic watched me closely, as if reading every word straight from the strains of fear tightening across my face. "Someone might have tampered with your car." His words froze my blood. I stared at him, pulse hammering harder. "You mean, on purpose?" "I'm not certain," he replied, voice low and steady in a way that made me both fearful and strangely calm. "But you cannot go home tonight." I opened my mouth to protest out of habit, but the truth hit me instantly. I couldn't go back to that apartment. Caleb might be waiting. I couldn't return to the school in the middle of the night, and I had no one to call except Jessica, and I couldn't place another weight of fear on her shoulders. Dominic rose and extended his hand to me. "My car is nearby. I'll take you somewhere safe." I hesitated, every instinct screaming caution. A strange man. At night, offering to take me away. But then I looked into his eyes, steady, unforcing, carrying no hint of threat, and found myself nodding. Dominic lifted me gently, as though I were made of fragile glass. He guided me toward a black car parked not far away, its engine still warm. A tall man stepped out from the driver's seat when he saw us approaching, wordless, giving Dominic a simple nod before stepping aside. Dominic opened the back door for me, his hand resting, briefly at my back as I climbed in. As the car pulled away from the bridge, I glanced over my shoulder toward the river. The darkness had swallowed every trace of the crash. No sirens, no flashing lights. No witnesses, just another ordinary night in Portland. Dominic sat beside me, silent, his hands interlaced, his gaze fixed somewhere distant. In the dim interior lighting, I noticed something beneath that calm exterior, a heaviness, a shadowed gravity, as if he carried more than any man should ever have to bear. I didn't know who he was or why he had been there at that exact moment, but one thing was undeniable. From the instant he dragged me back from death, my life had taken a turn it would never reverse. I woke in an unfamiliar room, pale light sifting through sheer white curtains, soft as a fading dream. The bed beneath me was so comfortable I barely dared to move, afraid any motion might break the fragile sense of safety cradling me. A thick beige blanket rested over my body, and beneath it my skin throbbed with bruises aching in slow pulses. I turned my head to the left and saw a neat wooden bedside table, a glass water carafe, a clean tumbler placed beside it, and a vase of white flowers. The room had a classic warmth to it, elegant without feeling sterile, everything arranged as though I were a welcome guest rather than someone who had barely escaped dying. I tried to piece together the night before. The car, the bridge, the darkness, the hand gripping mine. Dominic. I jerked upright but was instantly hit with a wave of dizziness, so violent it forced me back into the pillows. My head pulsed like it was being squeezed in an iron vise. The door opened, and a middle-aged woman stepped inside wearing a white medical coat, her silver-streaked hair pinned neatly back, her eyes sharp and observant. "Miss Carter, I am Dr. Vallon. Don't sit up too quickly. You're dehydrated and still in mild shock. Your body needs time to stabilize." I nodded faintly, too, overwhelmed to question how she knew my name. Dozens of other questions swarmed louder. "Where am I?" My voice sounded like sandpaper dragged across stone. "You're in a private medical facility receiving specialized care at Mr. Reyes's request. Dominic." His name snapped everything sharply back into place. I looked around, trying to determine whether this was a hospital, but there were no beeping machines, no harsh antiseptic smells, just silence wrapped around the space like a thick, invisible blanket. "Where is he?" "He's meeting with your lead physician. We conducted a full check. Fortunately, there were no fractures, only abrasions and soft tissue bruising. You will recover with rest." I sank deeper into the pillows, the entire world drifting around me in slow motion. I didn't know what to feel, grateful to be alive, frightened by where I was, or terrified by the realization that I was now somewhere entirely unknown, under the watch of a man I had met only hours earlier. The door opened again. Dominic walked in. Light spilled behind him, stretching his shadow across the floor. He wore a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. No tie. A look that somehow made him appear both refined and disarmingly raw. But it was his eyes I noticed. First, the faint exhaustion buried deep beneath their amber-brown intensity. "You're awake." His voice was quiet as he approached the bed. "I imagine you have many questions." Thank you. If you hadn't—" "You don't need to thank me," he interrupted, not harsh but firm enough to cut off any attempt at formality. "We can talk more when you're stronger. But first I need to ask you something." He pulled a chair beside the bed and sat, back straight, hands resting on his legs with the poise of someone trained for discipline. "Do you think someone wanted to kill you, Brooke?" The air in the room froze. I stared at him, my heartbeat climbing into my throat. "I don't know. I thought it was an accident. I had someone review the Fremont Bridge footage. A car was following you, but the plates were concealed, and your tires show signs of interference." He held my gaze without blinking. "I don't believe this was random." I clutched the blanket, my breath stuttering as possibilities crashed through my mind. Caleb. His name slashed through my thoughts like a shard of glass. I didn't say it aloud, but Dominic already knew. "If you suspect anyone, tell me. I can help." "Why?" I whispered. "Who am I that you would help me?" Dominic regarded me for a long moment. "Because I've seen too many people die in that river. I won't let it happen to you." In that moment, I didn't know whether to trust him or fear him. But I did know one thing with absolute certainty. After last night, I had stepped into a world I no longer controlled. I couldn't fall back asleep after that conversation. Dominic's question looping through my mind like an echo trapped in deep chambers, mingling with the image of my car disappearing over the bridge and the way he looked at me in the dark. Why did a man like him feel familiar somehow, even though I had never seen him before? By the time morning light slipped through the curtains again, soft as a whisper, I pushed myself upright without dizziness. The hospital gown had been replaced by a folded set of soft athletic wear left on a nearby chair. On the bedside table lay a small note written in firm, deliberate handwriting. "When you're ready, come downstairs. We need to talk, Dominic." I dressed and walked the hallway slowly, my steps still uncertain. This place was unlike any medical facility I had ever known. Every detail had been chosen with intention: the polished dark wood floors, the abstract oil paintings lining the walls, the warm golden lights casting soft halos on the high ceiling. I took the elevator down, and when the doors opened, I found Dominic seated at a table in a room that resembled an elegant lounge more than any administrative wing. He held a white, porcelain cup between his hands, staring out the wide glass window where morning sunlight washed over the deep red leaves of autumn maples. When he saw me, he stood immediately and motioned for me to sit. "How do you feel?" "Better," I answered. "Thank you for everything." He nodded, settling back as his expression softened just a fraction. "I think it's time I answer the question you wanted to ask last night. Who are you?" Dominic gave a faint, unguarded smile, not avoiding the truth. "My full name is Dominic Reyes. I was born in New Jersey but raised mostly in Oregon. My family isn't like others." He paused, searching for the right words. "My father was a man of influence, but not the conventional kind. I inherited his network investment firms, real estate, private security, and a few branches that never appear in newspapers." I studied him closely. "You mean—" "I work in the shadows, Brooke. Some things are legal. Some things fall between legal and necessary. I don't deal in drugs. I don't traffic people. I don't launder money for killers. But I'm also not the clean-cut corporate type. If you're looking for a perfect moral figure, that isn't me." The way he said it sent a shiver through me. No boasting, no excuses, just truth laid bare like an open file. "And why did you save me?" Dominic leaned back slightly but kept his eyes on mine. "Last night, I was returning from a meeting in East Portland when I saw your car falter. I thought I was only a witness, but when your vehicle went over the edge, I didn't think. I reacted." He paused, voice shifting, weighted by something old and unspoken. "I once failed to save someone. I swore it would never happen again." I heard the ache beneath his words, a deep wound he had buried under discipline and power. "And me? What do I have to do with your network? Dominic shook his head. I'm not sure. Maybe nothing. Maybe someone thinks you're a new vulnerability. Or maybe Caleb wanted to silence you permanently. Whatever. The reason. I will find out. My heart thudded unevenly as I sat across from him. Dominic Reyes was no longer just the stranger who saved my life. He was a man built from shadows and truths I didn't yet understand. And somehow, I had already stepped too close to walk away. We left the medical facility when the sun had already climbed high, the sky unnaturally clear after the previous night's rain. Dominic opened the door for me, the same black car waiting, the same tall, silent driver he simply called Joseph. Along the drive, Dominic said very little, allowing me to sink into my own thoughts, into layers of tangled emotion that had not yet begun to settle. Each time I glanced over, I saw his hand resting on his thigh, fingers interlaced as though holding something inside himself tightly, tension and control bound in the same gesture. The car turned onto a narrow tree-lined road that led to a quiet neighborhood on the western edge of Portland, where a 3-story, vintage-style mansion stood behind an iron fence, and rows of lavender bushes lining the walkway, looking more like something torn from the pages of an architectural magazine than the home of a man who operated in shadows. Dominic pushed open the heavy wooden door. Inside, dark wood interiors and the warm light from a chandelier created an unexpected sense of comfort. I want you to stay here for a while, he said, his voice calm but leaving no room for refusal. Until I know you're safe. I stood in the living room, feeling like a misplaced object. I can't impose on you like this. I have work, students, friends. You won't be helping anyone if you're dead, Dominic replied bluntly, without theatrics. I'm not saying it to scare you. I'm saying it so you understand the severity. My fingers tightened as I fought to keep my voice steady. You think Caleb truly wants to kill me? I don't think. I know. Dominic stepped closer and took a small USB drive from his pocket. You should see this. We sat on the sofa facing the large screen mounted on the wall. Dominic plugged in the USB, and with a click, footage from the Fremont Bridge appeared. My car entered the frame, driving steadily, and then a second car followed in the distance. Dominic paused the video, zooming in. The license plate had been obscured, deliberately. You see? This wasn't an accident. This was staged. I nodded, no longer capable of denial. And you think Caleb is behind it? Dominic didn't respond immediately. Caleb isn't smart enough to orchestrate something like this, but he could be working for someone who is. And if that someone knows you're connected to me, the danger is far worse. Connected to you since when? I asked, exhaustion sharpening my tone. Dominic held my gaze. Since the moment I took your hand on that bridge, you became a target simply because I refused to let you fall. I fell silent. That truth settled heavily, not because it made me feel special, but because it made me feel exposed in a world I never meant to enter. Does anyone else know I'm here? Only me, Joseph, and Maria. Maria is my housekeeper. She'll take care of you. I nodded slowly. Dominic walked toward the door, but before leaving, he turned back. Brooke, there is something you need to remember. If anyone approaches you, calls you, pretends they know you, you trust no one except me and the 2 people I mentioned. You're scaring me. Good, because you should be scared. They're not playing intimidation games anymore. Next time, they won't leave you alive. When the door closed behind him, I sat in the silence so deep I could hear the ticking of the clock. My heartbeat slowed, heavy and deliberate, as if each beat was imprinting an undeniable truth. I was no longer just a teacher. I had stepped into a place inhabited by people who didn't live by ordinary rules. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure I could leave that place whole. I had never lived in a house so quiet. No honking cars, no neighbors arguing, none of the familiar echoes of children playing in the school courtyard. Only the whisper of wind weaving through the trees and occasionally the soft footsteps of Maria moving across the wooden floor as she left meals or changed the flowers. Dominic did not return for 2 days. Joseph had driven me here, given a brief tour, then vanished behind a back door like a shadow. Maria was kind but discreet, asking nothing, revealing nothing, her eyes carrying a knowing softness, as though she had watched hundreds of people like me walk through this gate and never be the same. I grew used to waking among the towering trees, eating breakfast alone in a sunlit dining room where golden light spilled through tall glass windows. On the 3rd morning, Dominic returned. He walked in as if he had never left, carrying a paper bag filled with personal items, new clothes, and a phone. I installed security. Only 3 people can call you. I picked up the phone, saw his name in the contacts, then the 2 others, Jessica and Maria. Dominic sat across from me, one hand resting lightly on the table. I need to move you. This house is no longer safe. I set the phone down, breath tightening. Why? What happened? Someone crossed into the woods behind the property last night. Motion sensors picked it up. Joseph went out to check but didn't find anyone. I looked toward the window where sunlight fell across the tall trees. Beautiful, but suddenly cold. Where are you taking me? Forest Park. There's a cabin deep inside the preserve. Only one entrance, easy to secure. You'll be safer there. I didn't know whether to fear Dominic's ability to hide people or be comforted by it, but when I looked at him, I realized this wasn't a suggestion. It was a directive from the man determined to keep me alive. We left that afternoon. The car wound along a dirt road layered with pine needles, wind whispering against the windows like something trying to warn us. The cabin stood, among towering trees, dark wooden walls and deep-colored shingles blending seamlessly into the forest. Dominic opened the door for me, and for the first time, I saw him without his usual edge. I lived here for a while, he said as he guided me inside, after my younger brother died. The interior was unexpectedly warm wooden floors, a stone fireplace, a dark brown fabric sofa, and a tall bookshelf overflowing with books. Dominic gestured toward a small side door. Your room is there. There's a kitchen, a private bathroom. Everything runs on solar power. If the grid goes out, you'll still have what you need. I nodded without speaking. He stepped onto the balcony, where a wooden chair faced a small valley below. I followed. The wind was stronger there, carrying the earthy scent of decaying leaves and the damp breath of the deep forest. Dominic stood with his hands in his pockets, eyes tracing the faint purple hue resting on the horizon. I know this isn't easy, but you have to trust me, Brooke. They will come back, and next time will not be a warning. I looked at him, and for the first time allowed myself to accept a truth that frightened me. Dominic wasn't the danger. He was the safest place I had, and somehow, that terrified me more than being hunted. The next morning, Dominic was already gone. Maria left a basket of breakfast outside the door with a small note saying Dominic had urgent business in the southern part of the city and would return before nightfall. I ate in silence, watching light slide across the glass still fogged from the cool air, feeling empty in a way I couldn't name, as though part of me had gotten used to the quiet weight of Dominic's presence. After breakfast, I wandered through the area. Forest Park felt like a world entirely separate from Portland, trees rising so high they seemed to swallow the sky, the wind sighing through their branches in a way that made me feel as though I were walking through something sacred I wasn't sure I deserved to touch. A narrow trail behind the cabin tugged me forward. After about 10 minutes, I came across a small, old stone structure, nearly swallowed by moss and nestled between 2 giant trunks. A chapel, the wooden door weathered, the window panes blurred with dust and time. I pushed the door open. Inside were only 4 simple wooden pews, a low wooden altar, a few extinguished candles, and a crooked cross hanging on the wall. There was no electricity, but the dim light filtering through the cloudy windows layered the air with golden dust, serene in a way that pressed gently against the edges of my soul. I sat in the front pew, unsure why the place felt so peaceful. Perhaps because it was quiet. No Dominic, no Joseph, no Caleb, no memories chasing me, just me, and something unnamed. I bowed my head, fingers interlocked, and for the first time in years, I drifted into something like prayer, not to ask for anything, but to let my mind loosen, to let silence help me hear myself. Again. A soft creak echoed behind me. I turned. Dominic stood at the entrance. He wore no coat, just a dark shirt with the collar undone by 2 buttons. He didn't speak. He simply walked in and sat in the pew behind me. We remained in the gentle hush for a long time. You know this place? I finally asked without turning. I've been here many times, he said, when things got too heavy. It belongs to you? No, it's been here longer than any of us. Long before my family bought the land around the park, I never tore it down. Something about this place, it holds people together. I looked at him then. Dominic wasn't looking at me. His gaze stayed on the crooked cross, as if speaking to something inside himself. "Do you believe in God?" He shook his head slightly. "I believe in consequences. But sometimes I wish there was someone out there listening." I stayed quiet, letting the weight of his words settle between us. Maybe that was why he carried so much silence, because he had learned to shoulder things alone. And maybe my arrival in his world meant silence was no longer an option. I rose and moved to sit beside him. "If someone out there is listening, I think they sent you at exactly the right time." Dominic tilted his head, his gaze softening in a way I had never seen. Not cold anymore, but something like recognition, something neither of us had words for, yet both of us understood. The day Dominic left Portland to handle a situation in Salem was also the day I decided to return to school, knowing it might not be safe, but realizing I missed my students with a sharpness I could no longer ignore. Those small faces, the chirping voices, the clumsy essays, they were the only things anchoring me to reality through these long months of fear. I had told Dominic before he left that I would only stop by briefly, not stay long, and that I would be careful. He didn't forbid me, but the look in his eyes lingered in my mind. The entire drive from Forest Park to the small campus on the western edge of the city. The school was nearly empty when I arrived Friday afternoon. Classes over, only a few teachers tidying their desks and a handful of students lingering in the library. I stepped into the office, the familiar air folding around me like an old blanket. The vice principal looked surprised, then offered me a gentle smile. I pretended I had come to retrieve some documents, forcing my voice to stay even so as not to draw attention. I meant to stay 20 minutes, but the moment I stepped out of the office, I saw him. Caleb. He leaned against the wall across from Building A, where I used to teach first period English every Monday. His pale blonde hair slicked back with gel just as it always had been, but his face was more hollow, his eyes darker. He smiled when he saw me, a slight curl at the corner of his mouth that I had once thought charming but now chilled my spine. I froze, unsure how long I had held my breath. Caleb walked toward me slowly, as if the past 6 months had never existed. "You disappeared again," he said, voice steady, almost scolding, like he was talking to a child who had run away. "You ignored my messages, my calls, moved somewhere else. You stopped coming to school. But I knew you'd be back." I tried to stay calm, eyes searching for anyone nearby. The hallway was empty. "No one." "You're not allowed to be here," I said, my voice cracking with worry. "You're violating the restraining order." He laughed louder this time, the sound echoing in a way that felt suffocating. "A restraining order means nothing when you have no one left to protect you. Dominic isn't here, is he?" My heart clenched. How did he know? How did he know Dominic had left? I stepped back, but Caleb stepped forward twice as fast. His face changed, his eyes darkening with something festering and twisted deep in his mind. "You think you can walk away from me? You think someone like Dominic Reyes can protect you forever? He doesn't know you. I know everything." I pulled out my phone, but my hands trembled so violently I couldn't enter the passcode. Caleb saw, snatched it effortlessly, and slammed it onto the floor. The shattering sound cracked through me like a gunshot. "No one is coming for you, Brooke." He leaned close, his breath reeking of mint and cold cigarettes. "You're going to listen to me this time." But then footsteps echoed behind us, not hurried, not loud, simply firm and deliberate. Caleb turned. "Joseph." He materialized like a shadow, solidifying into form, face impassive, hands in his coat pockets, eyes cold and sharp as steel. Caleb stepped back, realizing he had miscalculated. Joseph didn't speak. He didn't need to. One look from him was enough to make Caleb retreat like a cornered animal. He turned away, but not before spitting out a final glance through clenched teeth. "This isn't over." When he disappeared behind the row of classrooms, Joseph stepped forward, picked up the broken phone, and handed it to me. "We should go. Dominic won't be pleased you were here." I nodded, unable to speak. My palms were still icy, but this time, I wasn't walking back to the car alone. And I knew Dominic would hear about this before I reached Forest Park. When I stepped into the cabin, Dominic was already waiting in the hallway. He didn't speak, didn't need to. One look at my face and at the shattered phone in Joseph's hand told him everything. He rarely allowed emotion to surface, but I saw it there, his jaw tightening, his chest rising with a restrained fury. I slipped off my coat, trying to steady my voice, but all I heard was the tremor shaking through it. I only wanted to feel normal for a little while. I didn't think he would. Dominic stepped forward, placing both hands on my shoulders, gripping gently but firmly, his eyes locked on mine. Next time, don't think alone. He knows where you were. He dared to approach you in broad daylight, in public. That's not a threat anymore. That's a declaration. Shame washed over me, not fear of Caleb, but the realization that I had made Dominic worry. You told me not to leave the safe area without someone. I know. I just wanted one moment of normal. He studied my face for a long time, then exhaled, loosening his hold though the tension remained in his eyes. From now on, you do not go anywhere without Joseph or me. All communication goes through encrypted lines, and Maria will adjust her supply schedule to avoid tracking. You think Caleb is watching this place? Not just him. Dominic turned to Joseph, who had been standing silently in the corner like part of the frame. Call Marcus. Intensify perimeter surveillance. Tell Isaac to check every camera primary and backup. Joseph nodded and disappeared without a sound. Dominic faced me again, something in his eyes tightening further. Caleb isn't working alone. He has help. Someone is using him. Someone pulling you into a game you were never prepared to play. I lowered myself into a chair, dizziness washing over me. What do you mean? Maybe you're not the goal. Maybe you're leverage. My vulnerability. And if that's true, every limit they once observed is gone. You said you never got involved with the worst of them. Dominic let out a short, hollow laugh, voice rough as aged whiskey. I never chose to. But that doesn't mean the people I've crossed don't have reasons to strike back. Silence filled the room. The wind outside pressed through the trees, making the branches slap gently against the window, like a reminder that peace here was borrowed, not promised. They sent me a message, Dominic continued, not through my phone. A package left at the old building on Burnside. Inside was a smashed phone identical to the one Joseph picked up today, and a piece of fabric that smelled like your perfume. My stomach twisted. They were that close? They want me to react, and I will. Dominic took a small metal device from his pocket and set it on the table, a tracker. Wear this. It alerts me if you leave the safe zone, and if anything happens, I will reach you in under 5 minutes. I picked it up, hands still trembling. Dominic, if their goal is to push you over the edge, they're succeeding. He looked up, holding my gaze with a steadiness that made my breath hitch. I'm not losing control, but I'm done being patient. For the first time, I saw in Dominic not just protection but a deep, cold fury, quiet but capable of burning everything in its path. And this time, it finally had a reason to ignite. The message arrived near midnight. Dominic had stepped out of the living room barely 10 minutes earlier to take an encrypted call, and I had been trying to calm my mind by rereading pages of old journal entries when my new phone lit up with a string of hidden digits. I nearly ignored it, but something urged me to open it. A video less than 30 seconds. In the flickering light, I saw a man tied up, his mouth sealed with tape, blood trailing down his temple. It took me several seconds to recognize him. David Howard, Dominic's close friend, the man who had come with him to Forest Park that first day. The video ended with a handwritten message on a piece of cardboard placed in front of the camera. Want him alive? Trade her. I ran from the room without thinking. Dominic was still on the call, but one look at my face made him end it instantly. I handed him the phone, my heart beat so loud I couldn't hear anything else. Dominic watched the video. His eyes darkened, jaw clenching so hard I saw the muscle jump beneath his skin. They've gone too far, he muttered, almost to himself. David has nothing to do with this. They're exploiting the blind spot. They want you to choose, I whispered. Me or David. Dominic stood motionless for several seconds, then snapped into action, issuing commands to Joseph through the comm device. Get the car. Bring Marcus. We move in 10 minutes. Isaac needs to find the location of this recording. Sweep all mobile. Signals across Portland from the past 2 hours. Prioritize the southern districts and the dock area. I moved toward him, trying to stay calm. I can help. No, he said instantly, his voice firmer than I had ever heard. You are the target. I will not let you become a bargaining chip, but if they can't find me, they'll kill him. And if I bring you with me, they'll kill both of you. He turned away as if the mere thought was unbearable. Joseph entered with a gear-packed bag and a holstered weapon. Dominic nodded. Before leaving, he looked back at me. "Brooke, lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone. If there is any strange movement around the house, press the red button beneath the bookshelf. She'll handle it." She? Maria. She wasn't always a housekeeper. She used to be a strategic analyst for the NSA. Dominic left before I could speak another word, the house sinking into darkness, and a fear greater than anything I had ever faced closing in around me. I sat down, staring at the phone still lit on the table, the video frozen on David's broken, terrified face. I barely knew him, but I knew that look. It was the same one I had seen in the mirror the night my car went over the bridge, the look of someone who didn't know how many seconds remained before everything ended. And for the first time, I understood. Everyone around Dominic, including me, was a target, because he had chosen to live differently from the world of shadows he came from. And the price of that choice was the blood of the people he cared for. The heavy storm that poured over Portland felt like a warning from the sky itself, as Dominic and his team drove away from Forest Park, leaving me standing at the window watching rain cascade down the thick glass, my chest tightening with a private tempest I could not quiet. Dominic hadn't told me the details of his counterstrike, only left me with that deep, unspoken promise in his eyes that he would bring David back alive, and that if necessary, he would go to the very edge of himself to make it happen. Maria never left my side after Dominic departed. Though she tried to remain calm, her gaze flicked toward the computer on the table often enough for me to understand she was tracking something critical: signals, encrypted clips, anomalies in the internal satellite network only someone like her could decipher. I had nothing to offer but prayer. Dominic was different. He was not a man who waited for miracles. Once the coordinates from the video were decoded, his team split into 3 groups, one creating a diversion in the southwest, another advancing from the docks, while he and Joseph slipped in through an abandoned drainage tunnel behind the warehouse where the last trace of the phone's signal had appeared. Dominic didn't take overwhelming numbers. He took a plan, each step calculated, each silence a trap ready to spring. When he and Joseph infiltrated the building, the first 3 guards were neutralized in 12 seconds. No gunfire, no bloodshed, just sharp, decisive strikes that dropped them before they could understand what was happening. Dominic moved down a narrow hallway into a dark room, where David sat tied to a chair, head slumped from exhaustion. A guard stood beside him, gun in hand, but before he could react, Dominic closed in from behind, twisted his arm, and slammed him against the wall with a crack that echoed like a funeral bell. More men rushed toward the noise, but Joseph had already released smoke and jammed their communications. In less than 3 minutes, Dominic carried David out, blood smeared across his shirt but none of it his own. As they sped away, Dominic spoke only one sentence into the comm system, his voice rolling like thunder through a storm. "Begin Phase 2. Marcus, coordinating from the west, immediately triggered a chain of fabricated data. The enemy's leader had his bank accounts frozen, and one of their weapons caches erupted in fire after an expertly timed explosive detonated while they were still scrambling from the assault. Dominic didn't merely rescue someone. He sent a message. He was not prey, and anyone who touched those under his protection would lose far more than they imagined. When Dominic returned, dawn had not yet broken. I heard the engine in the distance and ran outside before Maria could stop me. He stepped out drenched, streaked with drying blood, David staggering behind him with Joseph's support, pale but alive. Dominic looked at me with exhaustion carved deep into his features, yet something fierce still burned there, a quiet fire that had not dimmed through the night. I ran to him without hesitation. Dominic held me, pulling me close, and for a long moment neither of us moved. In that embrace I felt the faint tremor running through him, the weight of a justice reclaimed in blood and fury buried for too many years. And I knew that after this night, his world had crossed a line with no way back. He had declared war, and this time he was not fighting merely for his past. He was fighting for a future his and mine. 3 days after Dominic brought David home, the air in the Forest Park house still hadn't settled. Maria cautiously reinforced the security grid. Isaac built 3 additional firewalls around the communication network, and Joseph hardly stepped away from the backyard where sensors were checked every hour. I remained coiled with tension, even though the forest outside stayed as quiet as ever. Dominic grew quieter. He spent long hours in his study, the warm desk lamp washing his resolute face in amber light, as old files spread before him. That evening, When I brought him coffee, he was staring at an old photograph. I set the cup down and turned to leave when he spoke. "Do you know what was planted in your car?" I turned back, startled. No, I thought. It was the brakes. It wasn't. It was the acceleration controller. Someone altered the ECU software so the car would surge forward when you hit the brake. A cold ripple moved down my spine. "How do you know that?" Isaac decoded the leftover programming. It wasn't amateur work. It was authored by a professional group once active in Eastern Europe. Dominic pulled a printed traffic camera still from the files and placed it on the table. The image was grainy, but I recognized the silhouette standing beside my car hours before the crash. My heart sank. "Caleb." Dominic nodded as if responding to my thoughts. Isaac confirmed the malware. Bought on the black market. Primitive but lethal. Caleb either installed it himself or hired a low-level technician. His original motive was simple. He wanted to kill you for leaving him. I shuddered, clutching my sleeve. "So, what about the professionals? The kidnapping? Why did they get involved?" Dominic's eyes darkened as he walked to the window, looking out into the thick night. "That part is on me," he said, voice heavy with old regret. "The moment I pulled you off the Fremont Bridge, I painted a target on your back. My enemies always watch me. When they saw me save a stranger, bring her home, protect her, they realized you mattered." He turned back to me, his gaze cold and wounded all at once. "They approached Caleb right after the crash. They knew he wanted to hurt you while they wanted to hurt me. A perfect collaboration, his madness, their money and technology. Together they turned his revenge into a war aimed at me." I stepped closer, my voice barely steady. "So, I became your weakness because you saved me?" Dominic looked at me for a long time. "I once believed I deserved nothing but silence. But when you fell from that bridge, I didn't think I just moved. And now they're using that moment, that rare moment of humanity, against me." I had no words. His confession held the weight of wounds that had never healed. Dominic's gaze shifted to the photo of Caleb, sharpening with a lethal clarity. "He thinks I'll break. But he forgot one thing. I don't kneel, even if it costs me everything." I touched his hand gently. "So what do we do now?" Dominic studied my face, then nodded slowly. "We won't run anymore, and you will be the first one to speak the truth." I stared at him in shock. "What do you mean? You're going back to school. You're going to face everything. I've already sent the evidence to the federal authorities, with your identity masked. But to close this case, they need an official witness, and I'll be with you every step." For the first time since the crash, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a witness, a survivor, and this time, I wouldn't let the darkness swallow my voice ever again. We left Forest Park on a Monday morning wrapped in thick fog, the kind of gray veil that hangs low over the treetops before the sun has the courage to rise, and Dominic sat behind the wheel with gloved hands and his eyes fixed straight ahead, saying nothing for the first half hour, while I sat beside him holding tightly to the folder that carried every statement and piece of evidence tied to the accident, my heart shifting constantly between determination and fear as we drove toward our meeting with Agent Lee of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the one person Dominic trusted in a system built from too many layers and too many shadows. And when the car finally rolled into the secluded parking area behind the federal building, Dominic turned to me and placed his hand over mine, the pressure firm enough to anchor me but gentle enough not to overpower, as he said that if I had any doubt I could stop right there, that no one was forcing me into anything. Yet I shook my head and told him I had been silent for too long, letting fear dictate my life, and that if I did not stand up now, Caleb would do the same thing to someone else, and not everyone would have a Dominic Reyes to pull them back from the edge of a bridge, which made him smile, a quiet, rare smile in the midst of these heavy days. And then we went inside and passed through 3 layers of security before being guided into a sealed room with bulletproof glass and built-in recording systems where Agent Lee, a neatly dressed middle-aged man with eyes sharp as surgical steel, greeted Dominic with a brief nod and said he had reviewed the material Dominic sent and that this network was larger than he had imagined, and Dominic simply motioned toward me, letting me take my seat and open the folder, as I began recounting everything from the accident that had seemed like a fluke to Caleb's stalking, Dominic's intervention, David's abduction, and the horrifying video I received in the middle of the night. And as I spoke, I realized my voice no longer trembled. because every word I spoke became a brick laid onto the foundation of truth that had been buried so long under the grime of fear and hidden power. And when the session finally ended, Agent Lee gathered the files and said he needed time to process everything and build a prosecution plan, reminding me that while my testimony was critical, it was also not without risk, since Caleb and the ones backing him were only the visible tips of a much deeper iceberg. So when we left the building, Dominic slipped back into silence until we were coasting along the highway, where he finally told me I had crossed a line and that there was no way back. And I told him he had been on the other side of that line for a very long time, which he did not deny, merely nodded with a distant look, and said that once he believed things could be divided cleanly into good and evil, but the longer he lived, the more blood he witnessed, the more he understood that line never truly existed, that only choices existed, each with a price that had to be paid. And as I leaned my head against the window while the late afternoon sun spilled over the damp asphalt like liquid gold, I asked if the choices he made to save me, to stay, to fight for me, were worth it. And he said nothing until he turned down a road leading us back toward the woods, where the cabin waited as a fragile imitation of peace. And when he stopped the engine and looked straight at me, he said that if he could choose again, he would do everything exactly the same, except for one thing. And when I asked what that was, he said he would not wait until I was hanging between life and death to realize that I was the one thing pulling him out of the darkness. And I felt his hand close over mine, as if we had finally stepped together across some invisible battlefield. And in that moment I understood that between good and evil, sometimes the only thing guiding a person toward the light was the hand that refused to let go. And then a message from Agent Lee arrived on a gloomy morning, with mist still clinging to the trees of Forest Park. A message Dominic saw first before walking into the room where I was sorting through the teaching materials I once thought I might never touch again, placing his phone on the table, with the screen still lit, showing the stark words that there were official indictments for Caleb Grayson and 3 others, including a former police officer and a businessman who had bankrolled a money laundering organization tied to the group Caleb had become entangled with, and I felt my heart hammer with a blend of relief and dread as I told Dominic we had done it. But he only nodded, his eyes still hard, reminding me that indictments were one thing, while getting them to court was another, since they would try to stall, intimidate witnesses, or bargain. And when I asked about bargaining, he pulled out a typed letter from the drawer, unsigned yet unmistakable in tone, offering a deal that if I withdrew my testimony and all evidence, Caleb would leave Portland forever, disappear into Canada, and never come near me again. But reading it only stirred a slow, burning anger in me, because how could anyone think a quiet disappearance would erase David's suffering or the crash or the threat to anyone else? And Dominic burned the letter in a stone ashtray as he said, they knew I was the fulcrum and that if I stepped away the entire case would collapse. But he wanted me to choose not out of rage or revenge, only for what I believed was right. And as I looked out the window where thin daylight seeped through the glass, I realized I had spent months running and hiding and letting darkness drown my voice. Yet standing before the chance to end it, I finally understood that forgiveness was not the same as peace, that forgiveness was something I could carry privately, but justice was something the world deserved to see. So I said we would proceed, that I would withdraw nothing, because if I survived, then I must live with a voice. And Dominic did not answer, but his eyes carried a pride I had never seen so openly in him. And in the days that followed, Agent Lee launched the operation, capturing Caleb in a remote parking lot as he prepared to flee north while the other 2 were taken. In coordinated raids across 3 cities without gunfire or resistance, everything executed with quiet precision. And I was told I would be the primary witness in the preliminary hearing, and for the first time in my life I did not feel fear at the thought of entering a courtroom. And Dominic brought me to meet the Federal Bureau of Investigation's attorney who would guide me step by step, and before leaving he held my hand with a look that was both solemn and gentle, telling me I had done something not everyone had the courage to do, that I had chosen the truth, and that I was not alone. And I held his hand back with a calmness that surprised me, because now I knew that whatever the outcome, however long the hearing stretched, I had already crossed the final frontier of fear. And on the other side of that line, Dominic was waiting for me, not with the darkness behind him, but with a future where we could finally breathe in the light. I returned to the school on an autumn morning when fallen leaves covered the courtyard, and the wind moved through the familiar hallways as if reminding me that nothing in this world stays still forever. And the moment my former students rushed toward me with their small arms wrapping around my waist, my heart tightened with a mix of longing and tenderness that felt almost overwhelming. and the vice principal greeted me with a look heavy with emotion, saying nothing unnecessary, only placing her hand gently on my shoulder in a silent welcome as I stepped into my old classroom, where the whiteboard still carried faint streaks of chalk from the last lesson I ever taught, where the names on the roster remained unchanged, where unfinished tests still sat in their neat stack, and where children's drawings still hung along the walls exactly as I had left them, as though time had paused for everything except me, because I was the only thing that had changed. And I stood in that room for a long moment, taking a slow breath, letting memories wash over me like an old film playing in half light, recalling the first time I stood at the podium with trembling hands, the way children's eyes lit up when I read Frost aloud, when I told them stories about Martin Luther King, or when they asked me if I had ever cried because of a student, and I remembered the sound of the dismissal bell, the scent of new notebooks, the grateful nods from parents who had once placed their trust in me, and yet now I knew some things could never be returned to, not because I no longer loved the profession, but because I had crossed into a new chapter of my life, where my choices were no longer only about passing on knowledge, but about protecting truth, protecting myself, and protecting the people I loved. So I wrote my resignation letter by hand, each stroke of the pen slowing slightly in the sunlight pouring through the window, not because of fear, but because it took courage to accept that my path had turned in another direction. And when I took the letter to the vice principal's office, she looked at me for a long time before nodding and saying she understood and that she was proud of me, not just as a teacher but as a human being. And when I walked out of the office, my chest felt light but also pulled tight with the pain of leaving behind a place that had once been my entire world. And on the way home, Dominic waited in the car, saying nothing as he watched me closely until I nodded and whispered, I had done it. And he took my hand, steady and wordless, before driving us through the old streets where I had once lived, once studied, once loved, and once fallen apart. And near the end of the day, he brought me to a small cafe tucked beneath the canopy of blazing red maple leaves where we sat in a quiet corner unseen by anyone, where I watched people walk by living their lives just as I once had. And Dominic handed me a new notebook with a dark leather cover and told me he thought I should write again, not to forget but to understand. So I opened it and flipped through the empty pages before pulling a pen from my bag and writing the first line. I was once a teacher, I was once lost in the dark, but today I choose the light. And Dominic smiled softly and said, that was a beginning. And I nodded, knowing I still had many pains and trials ahead. But this time I would not walk through them alone because I had left the school but not myself. And that was its own kind of victory. And that afternoon Dominic told me to dress warmly, without saying where we were going, only holding my hand as he drove north along winding roads beneath the late autumn light that stretched across the world like a golden ribbon, while the breeze drifted through the cracked window, carrying the scent of damp leaves and pine, resin that reminded me of the early days in Forest Park, when I had been running from my pain, only to find peace in the arms of a man who carried more scars than I did. And we turned down a moss-lined stone path that led to an old wooden chapel nestled in the forest, a place I recognized immediately as the chapel Dominic once brought me to on a rainy morning when sunlight fell through the stained glass window in soft colors, and where I first saw him kneel in silent prayer. And he opened the door for me to enter the empty chapel, filled only with the sound of wind slipping through the walls and the faint scent of candles and pine. And I walked between the wooden pews, feeling an odd blend of calm and anticipation, before turning back to see Dominic standing in the center of the aisle, holding a small black velvet box, not kneeling yet, only watching me with an expression that seemed to weigh every word he was about to speak, as though this was not only a proposal but a vow. And he began by saying my name, his voice rough yet clear, telling me he once believed love was a luxury reserved for those without a blood-stained past like his, that he had lived in darkness day after day, hour after hour, until I arrived not with bright lights or grand promises, but simply as myself, ordinary, broken, brave, and honest enough to make him stop. And the sound of my own heartbeat thudded so hard it was as if it were knocking at the inside of my ribs, as he stepped closer and finally knelt, the stained glass light resting on his shoulders like a quiet halo. And he said he would never promise perfection because he had never been that kind of man. But he promised he would never let go of me, just as he had not let go when he pulled me off the bridge. And that in storms or in peace, he would always be the first to come for me and the last to leave. And he asked me to marry him. And I did not know when the tears began falling, perhaps when he said my name, perhaps when he spoke of the bridge where my life had nearly ended and also begun again, and I could only nod and throw myself into his arms as he rose and held me as though the world had shrunk to the space between us. And when he slipped the ring onto my finger, the last rays of daylight streamed through the window, bathing us in a miraculous glow that made me believe every pain I had endured was necessary to guide me to that moment. And in that silent chapel with no music, no flowers, no witnesses except the first stars beginning to glimmer outside, I received the most beautiful proposal a survivor could ever hope for, and I said yes not only to a promise but to a life. And our wedding took place as quietly as the way Dominic had entered my life, without noise or glitter, yet deep enough to be irreplaceable, held in the small chapel in Forest Park, where he had proposed and where the light always slipped through the stained glass like a gentle blessing. And Dominic had no relatives present, most lost or scattered through time and secrets unspoken, and his friends were quiet men in dark suits with eyes sharp like blades, yet softened with respect whenever they looked at him. And Maria arrived first in a pale gray dress, carrying dried lavender she called the flower of protection, and David, still limping slightly after the kidnapping, stood proudly as the witness, with hair more silver than before, but the same warm smile he wore the first day I met him in the sunlit kitchen. And Jessica, who never abandoned me in my darkest moments, sat in the front row with her eyes red from emotion and her hand tightly holding Mike's, offering me a small nod that said without words that I had finally found a safe harbor. And I wore a simple white dress without lace or jewels, only clean lines that hugged my shape and a thin veil resting lightly on my hair. And when I entered the chapel, I saw Dominic standing there facing the door with his gaze unblinking, as though afraid a single flicker of his eyes might make the moment vanish, wearing a classic black suit without tie or boutonniere, and only the silver watch I had seen him wear since the early days. And when I reached him, he held out his hand, the hand that had once killed, once shielded me from the edge of death, once held me through nights that felt like the world was coming apart. And today that hand trembled faintly as it reached for mine. And the ceremony was led by an elderly man with gentle eyes, whom Dominic called Father Anthony, a hermit monk he once saved from an attempted killing 5 years earlier. And the man did not speak elaborate blessings, only placed his hands upon ours, and said in a deep, warm voice that marriage was not the end of darkness, but the promise that even in darkness there would always be a hand to guide the way. And Dominic looked at me as he spoke his vows, his voice steady, yet his eyes brimming with emotion so raw I had to bite my lip to keep from crying. And he promised not perfection but presence, that he would never leave me alone no matter how many trials life hurled at us. And I answered with the truth I had carried since the night he saved me from the bridge, that if I had to live my life again, I would choose the path that led me to his arms, even knowing it was lined with thorns and wounds. And when Father Anthony pronounced us husband and wife, I did not hear applause or cheers, only the soft wind outside the door, the whisper of a leaf touching the earth, and Dominic's relieved breath before he kissed me for the first time as my husband. And afterward, we shared a quiet dinner at the old cabin, where Maria had prepared a warm meal with a small cake, red wine, and the glow of candles flickering across faces that did not smile often, but did so sincerely that night. And Dominic did not give a toast or speech, simply sat beside me with his hand brushing mine as if afraid this dream was fragile. And when night settled, we stepped onto the porch beneath long shadows of trees and a sky scattered with thousands of stars. And Dominic squeezed my hand and whispered he had never believed he could have this. A family, a love, someone who chose to stay, despite knowing he once lived in darkness. And I leaned my head on his shoulder, knowing that darkness would always be part of him, just as pain would always be part of me. But that night, beneath the stars and the forest and everything that once seemed impossible, we chose each other. And for the first time in my life, the darkness stepped back to make room for something miraculous called happiness. I first sensed that something was different on a winter morning when I woke with a persistent wave of nausea and a weariness that came from nowhere. And as Dominic made coffee in the kitchen with the early light slanting through the window and laying a faint band of gold across his back, I walked in and wrapped my arms around him from behind, feeling warmth spread through me like an instinctive response, only to recoil as the smell of coffee rose in the air, forcing me to cover my mouth and hurry into the bathroom with Dominic close behind, his face etched with worry as I bent over the sink. And after a few minutes I straightened, wiping my mouth, seeing in his eyes not only concern but a quiet glimmer of hope. And when he hesitated with the words, "Do you think?" lingering on his lips, I answered only with a small nod before we drove to the clinic that afternoon beneath whispering pines that seemed to guard a secret larger than both of us. And the doctor, a gentle woman with kind eyes, smiled after reading the test results and told me softly, "Congratulations, Brooke. You are about 5 weeks pregnant." And for a moment I could not breathe while Dominic squeezed my hand and kissed my forehead, as though terrified of disturbing something fragile. And on the drive home we barely spoke as he drove slower than usual, resting his hand on my stomach whenever the car stopped at a red light, his eyes no longer sharp with caution but softened by something deeper, as if he were seeing the future in every passing moment. And that evening we sat on the porch where so many wordless conversations and life-saving embraces had taken place, and Dominic laid his hand on my stomach again before telling me in a quiet, rough voice that he did not know what kind of father he would be, but he knew one thing, that he would never let this child grow up in fear. And I leaned my head against his shoulder and whispered that our baby would grow up in the light because its father had dared to step out of the dark to seek that light. And the weeks that followed passed like a tender dream, as Maria stocked the kitchen with teas for expectant mothers and replaced everything with the cleanest organic foods she could find, while David brought a stack of child psychology books he had collected over the years, telling Dominic it was time he read about fatherhood instead of the life of a man who once held guns. And Dominic grew sweetly cautious, checking the bedroom temperature, buying small pillows to support my back, and placing his hand on my stomach every night before sleep, whispering promises of a safer world to the child growing within me. And I still taught online and wrote in the early mornings, but everything now carried new meaning. No longer a way to run or to stitch old wounds, but a way to open the path of motherhood. And whenever Dominic looked at me with a blend of awe and overflowing love, I knew we were no longer two survivors, but two people stepping into a new chapter shaped by hope and the tiny heartbeat growing inside me. And each morning I woke to birdsong outside the window and the soft scent of coffee drifting from the kitchen where Dominic prepared breakfast, sunlight filtering through the leaves to fall across the small table holding my journal of pregnancy. And life now held no more night chases, no more watchful eyes, no more nightmares jolting me awake, only peace, slow breaths, and precious minutes I once believed were forever beyond my reach, while Dominic, though not completely changed, had softened like a sky after a storm, still rising early, still checking the perimeter, but now carrying, not fear of loss, but the quiet anticipation of a father waiting for a miracle to grow inside his wife. And we planted vegetables behind the house and adopted a small dog, Dominic, named Chance, as a reminder of the second chance life had given us. And Maria remained like a silent mother, always brewing ginger tea for my nausea, while David visited every weekend with laughter and lessons about survival. And I kept writing, chronicling my journey, the sorrows behind me and the happiness ahead, the light I thought I had lost but found again in the hand of a man who once lived his entire life in darkness. Writing not to claim credit, but to remind myself and others who feel lost, that even in the darkest place there is a way out, if one dares to walk toward the light. And I began to understand that true happiness does not come from grand gestures or noise, but from sitting together while rain falls, from the look in Dominic's eyes when he presses his ear to my stomach to hear our child's heartbeat, from the simple dinners where we gather around the table to talk about an ordinary day. And perhaps the most beautiful part is the quiet we share, the peace made of presence rather than words. And if you are listening to this story and wondering whether people can truly reach happiness after surviving storms, the answer is yes. But happiness does not arrive on its own. It is a choice, a journey, a courage not to turn back when the past tries to pull you under. And the story of Brooke and Dominic is proof that love can take root even in the most barren soil, if you believe in kindness, in the chance to begin again, and in someone brave enough to walk through the darkness with you. And what about you? Listening now, does this story remind you of someone in your life, someone who helped you stand up again? Or perhaps of a moment when you offered your hand to another through the storm? And if so, share your feelings in the comments below. Let your truth be heard, because we want to listen, to connect, and to bring you more stories that touch the heart the way this one did. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel. Click like, and share this video to help spread goodness, humanity, and life lessons we will continue to bring every day. And until we meet again in the next video, where a new story waits to be told and a new heart waits to be heard, I wish every one of you watching much health, a peaceful life, and days filled with laughter and warmth. Goodbye for now, and see you in the next video.